It was my 76th birthday, a quiet afternoon with too much cake and not enough conversation. The kind of day that feels more like an obligation than a celebration. I remember sitting at the end of the table, the white linen tablecloth wrinkled from years of use, a cheap paper banner sagging slightly above the window. My son was busy checking his phone. His wife, my daughter-in-law, hovered behind me with that familiar tight smile that never quite reached her eyes. The grandchildren had already vanished upstairs after the cake was cut, their laughter now echoing from behind closed doors. I wasn't expecting much, really. At my age, you learn to lower the bar and raise your tolerance. But what I didn't expect was to be reduced to a punchline. It was just a whisper so faint I almost thought I imagined it, but I didn't. She leaned close to my son as she was clearing the plates and said, "She's starting to forget a lot, isn't she?" And he didn't say anything. He just nodded, like it was already decided, like my mind was now a sinking ship they were watching from the lifeboat. I smiled to myself, pretending I hadn't heard, but something inside me wilted like the flowers on the counter that no one had watered since the day before. I hadn't forgotten anything. Not really. I knew exactly what day it was. I knew the name of every grandchild. I remembered the way my husband used to carve the roast with exaggerated pride on birthdays. I even remembered the dress I wore on my 40th blue, with buttons down the front, the one he said made me look like a summer sky in motion. What I did forget, perhaps, was how easily people change when they think you're no longer useful, or maybe I just didn't want to remember that part. The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur, the kind of blur you get not from age, but from emotional exhaustion. Every polite chuckle felt like it was hiding something. Every glance between my son and his wife felt like a secret being traded in plain sight. I helped clear the table because that's what I've always done, not because they asked me to. And when I handed her a plate, she said, "Thank you, Mom." But the word "Mom" was flat, like something she borrowed for the occasion. Not loving, not real. Later, as I sat on the porch alone watching the light fade into long streaks across the garden, I let the silence wrap around me like an old quilt. My hands rested in my lap, fingers curled inward, knuckles swollen but steady. I thought about how many birthdays I'd hosted, how many candles I'd lit for others. I remembered staying up all night once to bake a cake shaped like a race car because my son had begged for it. I remembered sewing a princess dress from scratch for my granddaughter because the store-bought ones were too itchy. I remembered everything. They think forgetting is a hole in the mind, but sometimes it's their presence, not our memory, that begins to fade. The truth is, I hadn't forgotten. I was watching who stayed, who spoke kindly, who made room for me at the table, not just because I was old, but because I was still me. That day didn't break me, but it cracked something. A hairline fracture in the trust I had built with my son, a fracture I kept trying to pretend wasn't there. But fractures deepen when you ignore them. And though the evening ended with polite hugs and a forced group photo, I knew something had shifted. A whisper had turned into a wound, and no amount of icing on that too-sweet cake could cover the bitter taste it left behind. A few days after the birthday, I couldn't find my keys. Not a big deal, really. They always had a way of slipping into coat pockets or getting buried beneath magazines. I've been misplacing things for as long as I can remember, even when I was young, and my mind was sharp enough to balance shopping lists, family, appointments, and everyone's birthdays without a calendar. I chuckled to myself, shuffling through the kitchen drawers when I finally spotted the keys peeking out from under a folded napkin near the toaster. Just like I thought, harmless. But the moment I told my daughter-in-law, I had lost them for a minute. Her eyes lit up, not with amusement, not with concern, but something else, something smug. Again, she said too quickly, That's been happening a lot, hasn't it? Her voice sounded coated in sweetness, but her smile was curved like a hook. I could feel it sink into my chest. I opened my mouth to respond, but she was already turning away, as if I had confirmed her quiet theory without needing to say a word. That evening, I overheard her speaking to my son in the hallway just low enough that she thought I couldn't hear. We really need to start thinking about what happens next. She lost her keys again today. What if it had been the stove I froze in place, my hand resting on the banister? What if it had been the stove? What if I were a child again, too young to be trusted, too fragile to be given control? I could feel the shift in how they were framing me, not as someone who had lived and raised and loved, but as a potential risk, a liability, an inconvenience. But I hadn't forgotten the stove. I hadn't even cooked that day. In fact, I had made sandwiches for lunch, because my arthritis was acting up. I'd cleaned up after myself, wiped the counter, even stacked the plates neatly. It wasn't the act of losing the keys that haunted me. It was the way they pounced on it, like they were collecting evidence, like they wanted to believe I was slipping away so they could hurry up and step into my shoes while I was still standing in them. The rest of the week passed with small but sharp comments. "Maybe you should write things down more," she said, handing me a notepad like a teacher to a slow student. "Do you want me to label the cupboards?" she offered, her tone so falsely kind, it made my skin crawl. I didn't need labels. I knew where everything was. I had arranged that kitchen myself long before she ever stepped into the house. The pantry still had my handwriting on the glass jars. I had kept the spices in alphabetical order, but none of that mattered anymore, it seemed. They didn't want to see competence. They wanted confirmation. By the time the weekend rolled around, I found myself second-guessing things I knew by heart. Did I really turn off the bathroom light? Had I actually locked the front door? I began to narrate my actions to myself in whispers, putting the keys in the bowl, locking the deadbolt. Not because I was forgetting, but because I knew that if anything went wrong, the blame would fall on me. They had set the stage, and every ordinary moment of my day was now under a quiet surveillance. One morning, she caught me standing still in the living room looking at a photo on the mantel. My late husband holding our son as a baby. "Everything okay?" she asked, tilting her head. "You looked a little lost." I wasn't lost. I was remembering. But she didn't want to hear that. The truth didn't fit the story she was telling herself. So I said nothing, and she nodded slowly like she had confirmed another suspicion. I began to feel like I was walking through my own home on tiptoe, careful not to drop anything, not to pause too long, not to forget to say the right thing, because one misplaced object, one skipped step, would become another checkmark against me in their invisible list. I was no longer a person with history and wisdom and warmth. I was becoming a case study, a cautionary tale, a woman under quiet evaluation by a jury that had already decided the verdict. I started locking my bedroom door at night, not because I was afraid of them, not in the way one fears violence, but because I needed one space where I wasn't being watched, where I wasn't being measured. I began writing things down, not the way she suggested, but in my own way, quietly documenting what was said, who said it, when, and where. I wasn't going to lose track. I wasn't going to let them twist the truth, because even if they thought I was slipping, I knew what they were doing, and I would remember. It was a Tuesday morning, one of those crisp, sunlit days where everything feels sharper, like even the wind has a memory. I came into the kitchen to find a list stuck to the fridge. It was written in black ink on a yellow sticky note, neat block letters, bulleted eggs, garlic detergent, prune juice. But it wasn't my handwriting. I stood there for a moment staring at it, feeling that tight knot in my chest again. My daughter-in-law came in moments later, carrying her mug and her usual performance smile. "Don't forget your list," she said, tapping the note. "You left it here yesterday." I blinked. "That's not mine," I said quietly. She tilted her head. "Of course it is," she replied too fast with a practiced softness. "You wrote it right after breakfast." Her certainty was unsettling, as if my own memory didn't count anymore, as if my reality could be corrected, edited, or overwritten with just a few confident words. But I hadn't made that list. I knew what I needed. I had told her the day before I still had garlic and I never drank prune juice. That alone should have been enough to prove it wasn't mine. But when I said that, she frowned. "You don't remember?" she asked, feigning concern. "You were holding your pen, and you even read it out loud." Her voice had this eerie blend of affection and accusation, like she was comforting me and prosecuting me at the same time. I felt my stomach twist. It was such a small thing, a sticky note on a fridge, but it hit me like a wave. Because it wasn't about the list. It was about her trying to place something in my hands and then claim I had forgotten I ever touched it. That night I searched for a handwriting sample. An old envelope, maybe, something she'd scribbled on anything I could compare to the note. I found one folded in a recipe book, her scrawl the same letters, the same slant on the G. It was her writing. I wasn't crazy, I wasn't mistaken, but she wanted me to believe I was, or worse, she wanted my son to believe it. I didn't confront her. Not yet. Not then. I just kept the note. I placed it in my bedside drawer with the care of someone preserving evidence, not out of spite, but out of fear, the kind of fear that creeps in when you realize the people around you aren't just waiting for you to stumble, they're subtly tilting the ground beneath you. The next day, she brought home prune juice. "Just in case," she said with a smile that made my skin crawl. I took the bottle, placed it in the back of the pantry, and didn't say a word. I didn't want to argue. I didn't want to make a scene. But in my head, I could feel something harden. Something that used to be soft and forgiving was beginning to grow sharp edges. I used to give the benefit of the doubt. I used to believe people meant well, even when they got it wrong. But now I was starting to understand that sometimes people aren't mistaken, they're methodical. And still I watched her. She'd mention things I never said. She'd casually ask if I remembered locking the door, then quickly glance at my son. Little drops of doubt, enough to form a puddle if you weren't careful. And my son, my own boy, the one I raised through scraped knees and math tests and broken hearts, he started to look at me differently, like he was looking through me, measuring my words for inconsistencies, watching for signs. There is a particular pain that comes not from being forgotten, but from being disbelieved. I began to feel like a ghost in my own home, visible, but no longer real. My memories weren't considered memories anymore. They were maybe she remembers or she thinks she remembers. I was being rewritten while I was still alive. But I remembered. I remembered the childhood flu he had at 7, the fever, the towel soaked in vinegar, the way I stayed up all night cooling his head. I remembered the first time he rode a bike. I remembered the way he cried at his wedding, and the way I held his hand before he stepped out into the aisle. I remembered everything they wanted to erase, and I would not forget myself no matter how many notes they planted. I started writing again, not grocery lists, but truths. I kept a little notebook tucked beneath my pillow, not for them, for me, to keep my own story safe. My days became observations. My nights became documentation. Because if they were going to twist the narrative, I was going to hold on to mine with both hands, quietly, fiercely. It started happening over coffee. Small circular questions. "Did you take your pills this morning?" Followed an hour later by, "Are you sure you remembered your pills?" Then again, after lunch, in a voice lined with false cheer, Don't forget your medicine. Okay. The first time I just smiled. The second time I said I had. By the third, I was wondering if I'd slipped into a loop without realizing. Not of my mind, but of their making. They weren't reminding me out of care, they were testing me, measuring how many times it would take before I hesitated, before I looked unsure, before they could say, I wasn't unsure. I took my pills every morning at 7:30. I laid them out in a small porcelain dish on the counter, the one with the blue rim that used to belong to my mother. I filled my pill box every Sunday, double-checking every compartment. I even took to writing it down in my notebook. Took meds 7:31, just to be certain. But they never asked to see that. They didn't want clarity. They wanted cracks. One day, while I was folding laundry, my daughter-in-law leaned in the doorway and asked, Do you remember telling me that story about your honeymoon? Her voice was coated in sweetness, but her eyes were already fishing for the answer. I blinked the basket of towels still warm in my lap. I've told a few stories about it, I said. Which one do you mean? She smiled. I don't think you actually told me, she said, tilting her head. I think you just thought you did. It hit me then, this wasn't forgetfulness they were observing. It was something they were cultivating. They were planting doubt, watering it with repetition, feeding it with kindness that tasted like control. Every conversation began to feel like a script, each line leading me into corners I didn't choose. And if I paused even for a moment, it was used against me. They repeated things I hadn't said, suggested that I got confused about days or people or plans, and when I pushed back, the tone shifted. We're just trying to help, my son said one evening gently. I wanted to believe him. God, I wanted to believe that he meant it, but help, I've learned, can be just another form of holding the leash. That night I watched a rerun of an old film I used to love, one of those black and white ones, where the heroine was clever, underestimated, and calm in the face of betrayal. I sat there wrapped in a shawl, clutching my notebook, like it was the last tether to who I was. I wrote down a line from the film. Just because they speak softly doesn't mean they're being kind. I underlined it twice. The next morning, she asked me if I had plans. We talked about it yesterday, she said when I looked at her. Remember, I didn't answer her. Not because I didn't remember I did. We hadn't talked. She had spoken at me in the hallway while my hands were in the sink. It wasn't a conversation. It was a breadcrumb she left to track whether I was still with it. I said nothing. I simply smiled and nodded. Sometimes silence is the only tool you have when the truth will be twisted. But inside I was cataloging everything, every repeated question, every convenient forgotten thing she claimed I said, every time my son watched me just a second too long waiting to see if I'd stutter or falter. And every time I didn't, every time I answered clearly, specifically, confidently, I saw that flicker in their eyes. Disappointment. They weren't waiting for me to fall. They were nudging, and if I didn't stumble soon, they'd find another way. Because once someone convinces themselves you're disappearing, your presence becomes inconvenient. They stop seeing you as a person and start seeing you as a problem to solve. And once that happens, even your truths start to sound like defenses. So I made a quiet vow. I would not let them convince me of a story that wasn't mine. I would answer their questions with precision. I would keep my voice calm, my eyes steady. I would write everything down, even the smallest exchange. And above all, I would not be baited into anger. Because once they can call you hysterical, they can dismiss you entirely. I wasn't losing my mind, I was losing their respect, and that was their mistake, not mine. It was subtle at first, the way she hovered near my study. The small office in the corner of the house where I kept my letters, my records, the will I wrote after my husband passed. She never used to go in there. That room was my sanctuary, a place where the light slanted through the curtains just right, and the smell of old paper and cedar soothed me like a familiar song. But lately I'd find things slightly out of place. A drawer half closed, a paper shifted, the kind of changes you only notice if you know every inch of a space, and I did. One afternoon, I heard her giggle. Not the sweet kind, but the clipped, smug kind that people use when they think no one's listening. I paused in the hallway just out of sight and heard her say, "She probably doesn't even remember where the will is. It's probably expired, if that's even a thing." A pause. Then another voice, my son's. "Just let her think she's in charge," he said flatly. "If something happens, we'll deal with it." The air went out of my lungs like someone had pressed a pillow against my chest. I stood there, one hand resting on the wall for balance, the other trembling slightly. If something happens. Like I was already gone. Like I was furniture waiting to break. It was the first time I realized they weren't planning to support me. They were planning around me. That night, after they left for dinner with friends, I went into my study and opened the bottom drawer, the one I'd kept locked for years. Inside, my original will, signed and notarized, folded with care, in a blue envelope. Alongside it, letters I'd written, over the years, to my son, to the grandchildren, to my late husband. I held the envelope, ran my hand across the seal. It felt heavier now, not with ink, but with meaning, with finality. I locked the drawer again, and this time I slid a small piece of clear tape across the edges, not to keep them out, but to see if they tried. It was childish, maybe. But when you are treated like a child, sometimes you have to respond in kind, not with rebellion, but with quiet resistance. 2 days later, the tape was peeled back, not torn, peeled. I knew it wasn't an accident. That drawer wasn't theirs to open. That will wasn't theirs to touch. But their curiosity was louder than their conscience. And in that moment, I understood something so bitter. It almost made me laugh. They didn't see me as a person with boundaries. They saw me as a door waiting to be unlocked. I didn't confront them. Not yet. I needed to know just how far they'd go. I needed to see the shape of their betrayal in full light, so I made a copy of the will and placed it in the safe deposit box at the bank. I updated it slightly, not changing the beneficiaries, not yet, but adding a clause about capacity. I wanted to ensure they couldn't twist things later, claim I was confused when I wrote it. I left a note in my handwriting, dated and clear. This was made with full understanding and purpose. My mind is clear. My heart is steady. The next week she joked again in the kitchen. "You should really think about updating that will. It's probably so old the ink's faded." My son laughed quietly behind his coffee. I didn't smile. I didn't argue. I just looked her straight in the eye and said, "Funny. I updated it last week." The silence that followed was thick as syrup. She blinked. My son looked up. "Oh," he said. I nodded slowly. "Yes," I said softly. "It's good to have things in order, isn't it?" Her smile faltered. His cup paused mid-air, and I knew in that small moment that I had tilted the table back toward balance. Not completely, but enough to remind them that I was still here, still lucid, still watching. They didn't ask any questions after that. Not directly. But I noticed the tension, the hesitations, the shift in how they moved around me, no longer assuming my absence, but wary of my presence. I wasn't fading. I was framing everything they said, storing it carefully in the museum of my memory. And slowly, steadily, I was preparing for something I never thought I'd have to do, protect myself from the very people I once protected most. It was a rainy afternoon when she brought out the photo albums, the old kind with crinkled plastic sleeves and pages that smelled like time. "I thought it might be nice," she said, "to go through some memories together." Her voice was light, but there was something else beneath it, that same studied sweetness that always came with an agenda. I knew better than to believe this was a gesture of nostalgia. No, this was another test. We sat at the table, the photo album between us, and she began turning pages slowly, her eyes darting more to me than to the pictures. "Who's this?" she asked, pointing at a grainy black and white image. I blinked once, then smiled. "That's my cousin Leon. We were 13, that was summer camp." She nodded, almost surprised I got it right. And so it continued, question after question, face after face. But it wasn't a walk down memory lane. It was an interrogation, dressed up like bonding. She didn't want to reminisce. She wanted me to stumble, to blank, to hesitate. She'd pause just long enough after each answer, giving my son time to glance up from his phone, waiting for the moment I'd say something wrong. And for a while I played along. I answered everything, not out of pride, but out of necessity. I needed them to know that this mind, though older, was not theirs to diagnose. But then she pushed a little too far. She tapped a photo from my wedding, my husband holding my waist, his cheek pressed against mine. I was glowing in a dress I sewed by hand. "And this one?" she asked, tilting her head. I narrowed my eyes. "You know who that is," I said calmly. "You were at our anniversary dinner. You saw that exact photo on the table." She didn't answer right away. Instead, she offered a patronizing little shrug. "Just checking," she said. "Sometimes people get faces mixed up." The implication stung deeper than any slap could have. I pushed the album away gently but firmly. "If I ever forget my husband's face," I said slowly, "then I'll be the first to say, I need help, but not before." My son said nothing. Again, just stared down at his screen, pretending to read something that probably wasn't even there. That silence cut through me more than her little games ever could, because I hadn't raised him to be cruel, but I had raised him to be quiet, to avoid conflict, to choose comfort over courage. And now that silence was being used against me. Later that evening, I took out the albums myself. I sat alone in my room, thumbing through decades of my life. Holidays, graduations, beach days, scraped knees, new bikes, wrinkled bedsheets, and birthday cakes. And every single face in those photos was tied to a memory I could still feel in my bones. The warmth of a child's forehead on my shoulder, the smell of garlic on a New Year's feast, the sound of my mother's laugh echoing off the linoleum floor. I hadn't forgotten any of it, but I was being put on trial for when I would. It became clear to me then, they weren't just waiting for my mind to slip. They were pushing, poking, planting, as if each confused look or uncertain pause could be turned into ammunition, as if the act of aging had made me a threat to their comfort. And those albums, they weren't a trip through love. They were a courtroom exhibit, and I was the defendant. So I did something small, something quiet. I took out a few of the most precious photos, the ones no one else would notice missing. My wedding, my son's first steps, my husband building our garden with dirt on his jeans and a grin on his face. I placed them in an envelope and slid them behind the lining of my dresser drawer, not to hide them, but to keep them safe from hands that no longer honored what they represented. When people treat your memories like a test, they stop seeing you as someone to love and start seeing you as someone to measure. But I am not a set of numbers on a chart. I am not a woman to be charted, scanned, filed under pending decline. I am still full of stories, full of fire, full of memory. And though the world may try to shrink me down into forgetfulness, I will stretch myself out in every story I remember loudly, stubbornly, beautifully. It began with a suggestion over breakfast. My daughter-in-law stirred her coffee slowly, deliberately, watching me from across the table. "We made you a doctor's appointment," she said, as if she were telling me the weather. "Just a checkup, nothing serious." I looked up from my tea, the steam rising like a veil between us. "I didn't ask for an appointment," I replied. "I just had my checkup 2 months ago." She smiled too quickly. "This one's with someone new. Just a specialist, for memory." That word memory hung in the air like smoke, acrid, uninvited. I looked to my son, hoping to see some flicker of discomfort of second-guessing, but his face was unreadable. He nodded. "Just routine," he said, avoiding my eyes. "Nothing to worry about." But it wasn't routine, and it certainly wasn't mine. This wasn't about concern. This was about control. I didn't argue. I've learned over the years that some battles are better fought in silence, not because you're afraid to speak, but because silence lets people reveal who they are without interruption. So I nodded slowly, sipped my tea, and said, "All right." The waiting room smelled like lemon cleaner and sterility, bright lights, plastic chairs, a television murmuring in the corner to no one in particular. She sat beside me, scrolling on her phone legs, cross-tapping her shoe in that impatient way of hers. I folded my hands in my lap and waited. When the nurse called my name, she stood too. "I'll come with you," she said too eagerly. I gently touched her arm. "No," I said, quiet but firm. "I'd like to speak with the doctor alone." She hesitated. I held her gaze, and then with the slightest shrug, she sat back down. I walked into the exam room with the posture of someone who remembers who they are, even if others try to make them forget. The doctor was young, kind-eyed, but clinical. He asked the usual questions, my name, the date, where we were. I answered each one with care, not rushed, not defensive. I even cracked a little joke when he asked me to remember 3 random words. "I'm a mother," I said, smiling faintly. "I've remembered worse under pressure." He chuckled, then got quiet again. He asked if I'd been feeling confused lately, if I'd felt out of place. I told him the truth. "No," I said, "but I've been made to feel that way. There's a difference." His brow furrowed. "Can you explain?" And so I did. I told him about the questions, the insinuations, the sticky note that wasn't mine, the way my daughter-in-law studied my face like she was waiting for it to crumble. I told him about the conversations that weren't conversations, the little tests, disguised as affection. I told him about the photo albums, the drawer, the tape. His expression softened as I spoke, not out of pity, but understanding. He asked if I felt safe. I told him yes, but not because of them, because of me, because I was holding tight to what I knew and who I was, and because I was watching. He performed the cognitive test anyway, politely, gently. I passed every question. When he was done, he closed the folder and looked me in the eye. "There's nothing here that concerns me," he said. "You're sharp. You're aware. You're careful." I exhaled. Not relief, just release. Like finally setting down a burden that wasn't mine to carry. When I walked back into the waiting room, she stood immediately. "How was it?" she asked, like a stage actress playing the role of a concerned relative. "All good," I said, smoothing my coat. "He says I'm perfectly capable and very careful." I let the words sit between us like a quiet challenge. She blinked, smiled, said nothing. On the drive home, she turned up the radio too loud, tapping her fingers against the steering wheel, like she had something to shake off. I sat in the passenger seat, watching the trees blur by thinking about all the ways people try to write your ending while you're still mid-sentence. But I was no one's ending. I was still here, still turning pages. That night, I added another entry to my notebook. "Doctor confirms cognitive health. alone in the room, no signs of decline. She didn't like that. I closed the book and slipped it back under my pillow, a shield in ink and paper. They brought me to that appointment hoping for validation, a medical stamp on their quiet campaign to make me disappear. But what they got instead was a woman they couldn't erase, a mind they couldn't mold, a spirit that refused to drift quietly into the version of me they had planned. And that more than anything scared them. I had always kept a wall calendar in the hallway just outside the kitchen, not the kind with motivational quotes or kittens dangling from tree branches, but a plain one, wide squares, clear dates, and my handwriting scattered across every box. Appointments, birthdays, reminders to water the hydrangeas, when to pick up more arthritis cream when the plumber was supposed to come. It wasn't just a calendar. It was my rhythm, a quiet drumbeat marking the shape of my days. It helped me see time clearly, made me feel steady, rooted. One morning I walked past the hallway and noticed the blank nail. The calendar was gone, just gone. I stood there for a moment, staring at the spot where it had hung for years, my hand instinctively reaching out toward the wall. It wasn't just the absence that jarred me. It was the quietness of it. No one had mentioned anything, not a word. I asked later that afternoon, trying to sound casual, "Did someone move the calendar?" My daughter-in-law looked up from her laptop, eyebrows raised. "What calendar?" She asked like the word itself was foreign. I gestured to the hallway, the one by the kitchen. "It's always been there." She furrowed her brow, tilted her head. "Was there one? Maybe you took it down to write something." I shook my head. "No, I haven't touched it." She shrugged. "Maybe it fell and you moved it and forgot. I haven't seen one." I watched her face carefully. Too calm, too quick. And just like that, my reality was placed under suspicion once again. The implication was clear. Maybe I forgot. Maybe it was never there. Maybe I imagined it. But I hadn't. I remembered writing on it just 3 days ago. I'd circled the dentist appointment. I'd marked the date of my granddaughter's recital, the one she said I wouldn't need to come to this year, because it was a lot of standing around. I remembered jotting down the note to refill my thyroid medication on the 14th. I remembered the pen I used green ink, because I couldn't find the black one. Later that evening, I searched the house, top to bottom, behind the coat rack, in the laundry room, in the garage. Nothing. No calendar. Not even in the recycling bin, which she had conveniently already emptied that morning. And then I realized why its absence shook me so much. That calendar wasn't just a tracker of dates. It was a record, a proof. It showed where I'd been, what I'd done, what I hadn't forgotten. And now it was gone. That night I sat in my room and opened my notebook, flipping to the back pages. I began reconstructing the calendar from memory, writing the days, the boxes, what I'd marked on each one. Not because I needed it for me, but because I needed it for the story. My story. I wrote it all, even the smallest things. April 9th. Prune juice appears in pantry. Not mine. April 11th, doctor's visit. Alone. No issues. April 12th, asked about calendar. Denied. Each line a thread in the web I was weaving quietly but deliberately. The next morning, my son knocked lightly on my door. "Mom," he said, "are you okay? You seemed confused yesterday." I looked up from my cup of tea. "I'm fine," I replied calmly, "just wondering where the calendar went." He paused. "Calendar." I held his gaze. "Yes, the one I've had up for years." He shifted uncomfortably, rubbed the back of his neck. I didn't touch it. That was all he said before walking away, but his eyes flickered just slightly. The flicker of someone who knows a lie is nearby, even if they're not the one telling it. It's funny. For most of my life, I thought memory was personal, that it lived quietly inside you untouched by others. But I see now how easy it is for people to try to edit your memory from the outside. They don't need to rewrite your thoughts. They just need to erase the anchors, move the objects, change the context, take down the calendar. But I was no longer just remembering for myself. I was gathering, building, protecting the shape of my life from the hands that sought to reshape it. And as I filled the final boxes of my reconstructed calendar, I realized I didn't need it on the wall anymore. I needed it where they couldn't reach it, and I needed them to know, without words, that I was not unraveling. I was recording every silence, every strange smile, every missing thing, every little theft dressed in care. They thought they were editing the ending, but they forgot I was the one holding the pen. The table was already set when I came downstairs. Cloth napkins, the nice dishes, the ones with the faded gold trim we only used on holidays. There was a roast in the oven, wine breathing on the counter, candles flickering even though the sun was still high. It was a performance. I could feel it in the air, the artificial warmth, the two wide smiles, the way my daughter-in-law moved through the kitchen like a hostess at a house she didn't own. My son wore a collared shirt. Even the children had been scrubbed in silence, sitting unusually still on the couch, their eyes flicking toward their mother, like they were waiting for a cue. I knew something was coming. I felt it the way animals feel storms before the clouds gather. I sat at my usual spot, folding my hands on the table, waiting. The roast was brought out. Plates were filled. Small talk hovered like smoke. Then just as I reached for the gravy, she said, it casual, rehearsed, like she was offering another helping of peas. We've been looking at homes. The fork slipped slightly in my hand. She smiled at me. Not a cruel smile, worse. A kind one. You know, she continued as if we were discussing a vacation, just in case things start to get difficult. It might be nice to have somewhere with more support, people trained to help, people who understand what happens at this stage. I didn't speak. My son shifted in his chair, but he didn't interrupt. Not once. She went on about resources, comfort, peace of mind. She used words like safety and respect. But every syllable was a shovel, digging a quiet grave for my autonomy. They had decided. This dinner wasn't a conversation. It was a notification. I don't need a home, I said softly. This is my home. She placed her fork down ever so gently. We're just trying to help. We don't want to wait until something happens. You've already had a few moments. Moments. That word again. The poisoned shorthand they used to reduce my life into question marks. The keys, the list, the calendar. All building blocks for a version of me they had invented. Not because I was failing, but because they wanted permission. Permission to take the reins to manage me, to reposition me from center to side. I looked to my son, my boy, my heartbeat, once. Do you think I need to be somewhere else? I asked, my voice calm, deliberate. He looked down at his plate, then back up at me with a soft sigh. It's not about need, Mom. It's about preparing. Preparing. I set my napkin down beside my plate and folded it precisely, slowly, buying time not to explode, because anger would serve their story. Fury would be their final proof. So I smiled. It took effort. But I smiled. I see, I said. You've both been planning this, talking about it behind closed doors, building a case. No one's building anything, she said quickly, hands up in mock surrender. We just want what's best. For who, I asked, me or you? Silence. That brittle kind of silence that shatters if touched too hard. My granddaughter dropped her spoon. No one moved to pick it up. After dinner, I went upstairs while they cleared the plates. I could hear them whispering again, but I didn't care anymore. Let them whisper. Let them strategize. What they didn't realize is that I'd already been preparing too, not for a decline, but for a defense. Quietly, thoroughly, patiently. I had documentation. I had witnesses. I had my own appointments, my own savings, my own mind still intact, still sharp. I opened my notebook that night and wrote Sunday dinner, formal table, announcement of intent, no discussion, tone final. Then underneath it, they forget I lived through wars, births, losses, and men who underestimated me. I will not be erased by a woman who has only just begun to learn how to fold napkins. They wanted to house me in quiet, but I would not be boxed. I would not be gentled into a corner of someone else's comfort. My life is not a burden to be placed behind polished glass and labeled fragile. I am not an heirloom. I am the architect of this house, this family, this entire bloodline, and I am not leaving quietly. It was raining that morning, soft and steady, the kind of rain that slows the world just enough to make everything feel a little more deliberate. I slipped on my coat, pulled my hair back, and took the umbrella from the stand by the door. My daughter-in-law was in the living room, her laptop balanced on her knees, her eyes flicking to me as I grabbed my purse. Going somewhere, she asked, light and casual. Just a walk, I replied. Needed some air. She nodded, but I saw at that brief flicker of calculation behind her smile. She didn't offer to come. She never did when she assumed I had nowhere to go. But I wasn't just going for air. I was going to the bank. I hadn't been in a while. Most of my finances were online now, set to autopay and clean lines. But there's something sacred about showing up in person, about speaking face to face with someone who doesn't already see you through the warped lens of age. So I walked in, shook the rain from my coat, and approached the counter. The woman behind the desk was young, polite, and a little surprised to see someone of my age without assistance. "How can I help you today, ma'am?" I smiled. "I'd like to review some recent inquiries on my accounts," I said, keeping my tone pleasant but firm, "and I'd like to check the status of any activity regarding powers of attorney." She blinked, then straightened. "Of course. Let me pull that up for you." It took a few minutes. I sat in the leather chair by her desk, my hands folded over my bag, the sound of rain tapping the glass behind us. When she returned, her tone had changed, softened slightly more careful. "There was an inquiry last week," she said. "Someone called asking about whether power of attorney could be activated, if there was a previous agreement on file. But..." She hesitated. "We couldn't disclose anything without confirmation from you." My throat tightened. "Who called?" I asked, already knowing. She checked the note. It was a woman. Said she was your daughter-in-law. Asked if there was a way to expedite control in case of mental decline. Expedite control. I repeated those words in my mind like a bell tolling in an empty chapel. I thanked the woman, asked her to place a note on my account. No changes without in-person verification from me. Ever. She nodded, made the note, and I watched her type the words. My hands trembled slightly, not from age, but from restraint, from knowing how close I had come to being silently erased. Outside, I stood under the awning, watching the rain fall heavier now. People rushed past me with umbrellas, their lives moving too fast to notice the woman standing still. I clutched my purse to my chest and closed my eyes. She had tried. Not openly, not directly, but in that subtle, insidious way, planting calls, asking questions, creating the paper trail before I even knew one was forming. When I returned home, she didn't ask where I'd been, but I noticed how she paused when I walked past, how her eyes followed me, not with concern, but with suspicion, and I smiled, not to her, to myself. That evening after dinner, I stood at the kitchen sink washing the dishes by hand, an old habit more calming than useful. She came in behind me, pouring herself tea. "Busy today?" she asked. "Just sorting a few things," I replied. She stirred her cup, watching the swirl. "If there's ever anything you need help with finances paperwork, you know we're here." I dried my hands on a towel, turned to face her. "I've got it covered." A beat. Well, she said, that smile returning, "You've always been so independent. It's admirable." I looked at her for a long moment. "Independence isn't something I've grown out of," I said softly. "It's something I earned." She didn't reply, just sipped her tea and left the room. Later that night, I updated my notebook again. April 15th, bank confirms inquiry made. Language used, expedite control. No legal authority given. Note placed for in-person authorization only. Underneath it, I wrote one more sentence. They underestimated how closely I watch the people who watch me. They thought I was fading, that I wouldn't notice, that I'd be too tired to push back. But the thing about growing older is this: your body may slow, but your mind, if you guard it, feed it, trust it, it sharpens like a blade. I wasn't losing control. I was reclaiming it, one quiet, deliberate move at a time. There was a time I wrote my will with warmth in my heart. I remember sitting at the kitchen table years ago after the funeral, after the casseroles, after the silence settled in like dust, and putting pen to paper. I had no bitterness then, only grief. But even through that grief, I was clear about what mattered. I left things not based on wealth or favor, but memory, meaning. The quilt my mother sewed went to my granddaughter, because she once cried into it after a skinned knee. The silver necklace, the one I wore on every anniversary, was meant for my daughter-in-law, back when I believed she would wear it with grace. And to my son I left the house, this house, our home, not because he asked for it, but because I thought it would shelter him the way it had always sheltered me. I wrote that will in love. And now, sitting at the same table all these years later, with the light hitting differently and the air thick with the weight of everything unsaid, I reread it with a new heart, not cold but no longer naive. The words on the page were mine, but they didn't fit anymore. Not after the way she'd circled me like a predator disguised as a caregiver. Not after he let silence answer where loyalty should have lived. Every item in that will had once felt like a story passed down. Now it felt like a compromise, a reward for patience I'd mistaken for love. I traced my signature at the bottom of the page and felt nothing. I poured myself a cup of tea and sat in the quiet for a long time, the will open in front of me like a diary written by someone I no longer recognized. I thought about what it meant to change it, not out of vengeance, but of clarity. Because the woman who wrote that document years ago had never imagined a future where she would be gaslit in her own home. She didn't imagine whispers at birthday parties, missing calendars, locked drawers opened without consent. She imagined her family would rise to meet her with grace, not suspicion. But here I was, and I wasn't broken. I was simply awake now. I walked to the cabinet and pulled out my old files, birth certificates, bank statements, the first draft of the will in blank paper, clean untouched. A new page, not just legally, emotionally. I would write another will, not in haste, not in pain, but in truth. I called the lawyer the next morning. He remembered me, said he still had the file on hand. Asked if I wanted to come in next week. No, I said. I'd like to come today. There was a long pause. Then, of course, 2 o'clock. I arrived early, coat-pressed lipstick on. I looked like any other elderly woman taking care of routine matters, but inside I was solid as oak. When he led me to the conference room, I handed him both the old will and a typed draft of what I wanted revised. I'd spent the morning not just removing names, but rebalancing the meaning of what I owned. The necklace that was going to the nurse who checked on me after my fall last year, who made me tea and sat with me for hours even after her shift ended. The quilt. It was going to a community center that ran a shelter for young women. Let someone new be warmed by that comfort. As for the house, I paused, breathed deep, and said, "It's going into a trust, not for anyone who tried to silence me, but for whoever remembers me with kindness, not control." He didn't ask for details, just nodded and began drafting. I thought about what it meant to leave behind not just possessions, but statements, messages, lines drawn in ink that would outlast my hands. I was not writing from bitterness. I was writing from survival. Because love, real love, does not erase, manipulate, or quietly maneuver around your dignity. I signed the new document slowly, deliberately, not with shaking hands, but with steady resolve. When I was done, the lawyer folded the papers neatly and asked if there was anything else. "Yes," I said. "I want a clause added. 1 sentence." He raised his pen. I dictated. This document was executed with full understanding, clarity, and purpose by a woman of sound mind, sharp memory, and unshakable dignity. He smiled as he wrote it. "That's one I haven't seen before." "No," I replied. "I imagine you haven't." As I left the office, the wind brushed past me like a blessing. I walked to the bus stop, my shoulders straighter than they'd been in weeks. I didn't look back. I had written a will once in love. Now I'd written one in truth. And it felt in a strange way, like the first real gift I'd given myself. The next morning I woke before the sun. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, the early light just beginning to stretch across the curtains. The house was still, and for the first time in weeks, my breath felt calm, my chest no longer tight with dread. I rose slowly, not because I was weak, but because I wanted to feel every part of the movement, each step away from who I had been forced to become in this house. I pulled the suitcase from the back of the closet. Not the big one, not the one reserved for long trips or hospital stays, just the small one with the leather handle, the one I used to pack when I visited friends in the next town or stayed with my sister when she was still alive. I filled it slowly with the kind of reverence usually reserved for rituals. A few dresses, the green shawl he bought me for our 25th anniversary, the thick socks that made winter bearable, my notebook, a copy of the new will folded and placed carefully between the pages of a book I'd reread 100 times. I didn't pack out of fear. I packed for peace. Downstairs, the house was silent. My daughter-in-law's shoes were by the door, spotless as always. My son's jacket hung over the banister like it had every day since winter began, lazy, familiar. I stood in the entryway for a long moment, looking around. This place had once been a cradle of laughter, the walls echoing with my husband's baritone hums, my son's endless questions, the smell of cinnamon and fresh rice, the little squeals of grandchildren too young to be cruel. But now it was only shadows of that, like someone had traced the outline of my life in chalk and walked away. I left a note on the table. I didn't write much, just gone for a few days. Do not call. Do not follow. This is not an emergency. It is a decision. No name, no apology. I locked the front door behind me, not to keep them out, but to remind myself that it was my key turning in the lock, that I still had hands strong enough to choose. I walked to the bus stop, suitcase in tow, the morning air crisp and honest. I hadn't felt that in weeks. No second guessing, no double meanings, no kind words laced with poison. Just the wind, just the quiet. The bus driver greeted me with a gentle nod. Heading somewhere special, he asked. Just away, I said. Away is enough. I sat by the window and watched the neighborhood past the park where my son learned to ride his bike. The grocery store, where I used to chat with the butcher, who remembered my name even when I forgot the church where I lit a candle the day my husband died. Each place waved goodbye like an old friend. When I arrived at the small cottage I'd rented, it smelled like dust and lavender. Nothing fancy, just a little kitchen, a soft chair, a clean bed, a window that faced east. I unpacked in silence, folded each item as though it had been through battle and deserved a respectful place to rest. I brewed tea, wrapped the shawl around my shoulders, and sat by the window, letting the light pool across my lap. I wasn't running away. I was claiming space where I could think, breathe, be. I hadn't felt the fullness of my own presence in so long, always shrinking, always dodging the eyes that watched for failure, the ears that listened for cracks in my voice. Here there were no tests, no whispers, just me, and that was enough. I opened my notebook and began a new page. April 22nd arrived, alone by choice, warm sunlight, no noise, no performance, full heart. I paused, then wrote, "An empty room is better than a crowded one filled with doubt." And then, as the tea cooled and the sky turned pink with evening, I let myself cry. Not from sadness, but release, like someone exhaling after holding their breath too long. The tears were soft quiet like prayer. I didn't rush them. I let them fall. Because grief isn't always about death. Sometimes it's about letting go of the life you thought you'd be allowed to finish with grace, and realizing that grace has to come from within, not from those who share your blood. And in that little cottage with my small suitcase and my silent phone, I finally felt full again. The receptionist remembered me before I could even speak. "Mrs. L," she said with a small smile, "we haven't seen you in a while." Her voice carried warmth, no hesitation, no sideways glances. I nodded and returned the smile. "It's good to be remembered," I replied. I had called ahead, of course, set the appointment. It wasn't the kind of thing I wanted to rush. I'd already updated the will on paper, but this visit was about ensuring there was no room left for interpretation. The old will had been written with trust. This time it would be sealed with intention. Every clause, every word, every pause. When I stepped into the conference room, the lawyer stood and extended his hand. He was older now, too gray at the temples, but his eyes were still sharp. "I was surprised to hear from you," he said gently as we both sat, but not too surprised. I handed him the documents I had carried in my satchel, each one organized and clipped with care. "I need this to be final, clear, unshakable." He nodded, unfolding the pages slowly. "I take it things have changed?" he asked. I met his eyes. "They've shown me who they really are. I'm simply responding." He didn't ask what had happened. He didn't need to. Good lawyers know that silence often holds more than stories do. He read the revisions, the adjusted beneficiaries, the new allocations of property keepsakes, responsibilities. He paused at the clause I had added in my own handwriting, the one about clarity, purpose, dignity. His lips pressed together in quiet approval. "This is precise," he said. "Thoughtful, legally sound, and if I may say so, powerful." I sat back in my chair, feeling something settle inside me. Not victory, not satisfaction, but peace. The kind of peace that comes from knowing you've done what needed to be done, even if no one thanks you for it, especially then. He asked if I wanted to include a letter of intent, something not required by law, but often useful in case of challenges. "Let them know why you made these changes in your own voice," he said. I considered that, writing it down one final time as if speaking to them from a place they couldn't interrupt. "Yes," I said. "Let's include a letter." He handed me a sheet of thick stationery and a pen. The ink flowed smoothly, the words following like they'd been waiting for this chance to leave my chest. "To those who once called me mother, this is not an act of punishment. It is an act of protection. I offered you love. I offered you my home, my memories, my trust, and you repaid it with suspicion, silence, and quiet attempts to unmake me before I was ready to go. This will is not revenge. It is clarity. It is the restoration of my voice in a room where it had been quietly erased. If you read this, know that I did not forget you. I remembered everything. That is why you are no longer here." I signed it, folded it, handed it back. He took the letter, sealed it with the documents, and said, "They'll feel this more than anything you could have shouted." I left the office feeling lighter. The sky was overcast, the air humid with the smell of coming rain. I didn't rush. I walked slowly down the street past the florist shop, the little bakery that still made the sweet rice cakes my husband used to adore. I stepped in and bought one warm and soft in my palm. I hadn't bought one in years. As I sat on a bench outside the post office unwrapping the cake, I thought about how strange it is that life can take you from love to defense without ever warning you that the same hands you used to feed will someday try to take the spoon from yours. But I wasn't bitter. I was resolute. The law now spoke for me where my voice had once gone unheard. I had been dismissed with smiles, minimized with care, and manipulated with softness, but now my truth was written in ink, notarized, backed by statute. I took a bite of the cake. It tasted just like I remembered. And for the first time in a long while, I wasn't afraid of being forgotten, because my truth now would outlive their version. The envelope was thick, heavier than it looked. Inside it held every word that mattered, the revised will, the notarized letter, the clear statement of my mind, my rights, myself. I carried it with both hands pressed against my chest like something sacred, and maybe it was. In a world that so often ignores the voices of women like me, that envelope was my voice, ironed flat, sealed in law untouchable. I walked it down to the courier office myself. No postmarks, no trusting others to take care of it. I wanted to see it leave my hands. I wanted to feel the weight transfer from my palms into something larger, more official, more final. The woman at the counter asked me the usual questions, anything fragile, hazardous, or perishable. I smiled. "Just the truth," I said. She laughed, not knowing how serious I was. She stamped it, logged it, and when she handed me the tracking number, I held it like a badge, a receipt for my defiance. I had it sent to their house, not just to my son, to both of them, addressed formally. I wanted her to open it. I wanted her to read each line and feel how cold and exact a mother's resolve can become when treated like an afterthought. When she dared to question my capacity, when she reached into drawers that didn't belong to her, when she made phone calls to institutions as if I were already gone, this was her answer. I didn't expect a phone call. I didn't want one. What I got instead was silence. The kind of silence that comes not from confusion, but from impact. They hadn't expected this. They had mistaken my slowness for weakness, my politeness for permission, my quiet for surrender. But they had never asked what I was doing in that silence, what I was building in it. A week passed, then another. No calls, no messages. I received only one thing, a text from my son, a single sentence. You didn't have to do that. I stared at it for a long time. I thought about all the things I didn't have to do. I didn't have to raise him with patience. I didn't have to keep my door open for years while he found his way. I didn't have to let his wife into my kitchen, into my holidays, into my trust. I didn't have to explain myself when they started questioning things I never forgot. But I did. So I typed back, "You're right, I didn't, but I did it anyway." I never heard back. That night I pulled my chair up to the window, the one in my cottage that faced east where the moonlight slipped across the floor like a hush. I made myself tea not because I needed comfort, but because I deserved ritual. I lit a candle not for them, but for me, a way to honor the boundary I had finally drawn. I reread the documents, not because I doubted them, but because I needed to feel the weight again. Each word held power, each clause a small reclaiming. There in black and white was a record of my awareness, a refusal to be silently rewritten, a declaration, I am still here. I still decide. It wasn't about money. It never had been. It was about voice, about who gets to tell the story when someone gets older, about who gets believed. Too often it's not us. Too often we are talked around not to. We are narrated like characters in someone else's fiction, frail, confused, burdensome. But I would not let them author my ending. This paper, this will, was my autobiography in its purest form, a map of my values, my last lines of defense. It would outlast my body. It would speak even when I could not. And more than anything, it would deny them the comfort of pretending they didn't know what they were doing. They would remember opening that envelope, the weight of it, the slow realization, the clarity. They would remember that I said nothing in return, offered no arguments, demanded no apologies. I didn't need to. The paper had spoken louder than I ever could. And in that silence, I found something I hadn't felt in years. Power. It came without a knock, without a word. The courier dropped it off in the late afternoon, a small envelope, no return address, just my name handwritten on the front in ink I recognized. I found it tucked beside the door, its presence almost apologetic, as if even it knew it had arrived too late. I brought it inside, laid it on the table, and stared at it while the kettle warmed. I didn't open it right away. I knew what it was. Not legally, but emotionally. A reply or an attempt at one. I sipped my tea slowly, the clock ticking behind me, letting the quiet stretch long enough to hear my own heartbeat. When I finally slid it open, the paper inside was brief. No salutation. Just 5 lines, written in my son's familiar, uneven scrawl. "We didn't mean to make you feel that way." She thought she was helping. I didn't know how to stop it. Maybe we misunderstood. I hope you're okay. I folded it once, then again, then tucked it back in the envelope without a word. There was nothing more to say. No apology, no acknowledgement of what they'd done, only vague language, the kind that leaves a window open without ever walking through it. A letter not to heal, but to clear conscience. I placed the envelope in the drawer with the others, old birthday cards, faded recipes, in my mother's handwriting, clippings, of my grandchildren's school art. It didn't belong there, not really. But I wasn't ready to throw it away either, not yet. That evening I noticed how quiet the house had become. But it was a different kind of quiet now. Not the heavy silence of dismissal, but the kind that holds space. Space for me. Space to breathe, to move, to read my own thoughts again, without someone watching the corners of my memory. No more whispered evaluations, no more staged tests over dinner, no more curated kindness laced with control. The mail stopped arriving with strings attached, the visits too. Fewer calls, less noise. It would have stung once, but now it felt like peace. Because here's the truth. They never understood. I didn't need their permission to remain whole. I didn't need them to approve my sharpness or validate my clarity. I didn't need to be treated like glass to prove I wasn't breaking. All I needed in the end was space, and I had it. I sat by the window that night and looked out at the garden, overgrown but proud. The daffodils had come up early yellow and stubborn. The rosemary bush I planted with my husband years ago still thrived beside the fence, reaching outward in all directions. No matter how much was cut away, it kept growing. That's what I had become. Not brittle, not withered, but weathered, resilient, rooted. I hadn't lost my mind. I had used it carefully, deliberately, with every quiet observation and every page of my notebook. They thought they were preparing for my decline. But I was preparing too, not for the end, but for the reclaiming. I stood and closed the curtains gently. No ceremony, no speeches, just stillness. Because sometimes power doesn't come from the storm. Sometimes it comes from what remains after the storm, steady, intact, quietly radiant.